Hello. Welcome to another edition of Public Affairs Public Access. I'm your host, David Hutzelman, where we discuss public policy issues from a mainly libertarian perspective. This evening, we're going to be talking about the case for diversity in education, especially economics education. And to do that, I brought along an expert from the Houston area, the founder and CEO of the Institute for Energy Research, and my good friend, Rob Bradley. Rob, it's good to have you here tonight.
Thank you, David.
Rob has got degrees from Rollins College and the University of Houston, as well as a PhD in economics from International College in Los Angeles. And we're pleased to have him here tonight. You may have also seen him, his frequent letters to the editor in the Houston Chronicle, as well as an occasional op-ed about various subjects that deal with both energy and sometimes climate issues as well. So Rob is well known in the Houston area. Tonight, we're going to be talking about economic education as well as education in other areas and the need for diversity in that education. And one of the issues that's been predominant is, of course, in economics education is the issue of market failure versus government failure. And we're going to get to that in a little while. But Rob has a point of view which he believes is important for education, and he refers to it as the science of liberty. And it goes further than just economics education. It goes to history and other issues, philosophy as well. And Rob, maybe you could give us just a brief overview of the science of liberty and how you see that evolving in the current ecological and educational environment.
Sure. The science of liberty is a multidisciplinary intellectual tradition that explains how in complex societies things work best with voluntary relations between adults as versus a central plan from a government agency. The science of liberty is very multidisciplinary. There's certainly economics, which provides qualitative laws and insights into human behavior, but understanding liberty also includes insights for philosophy, social and political philosophy, history, U.S. and world history, and certainly government. And my interest in education issues, it really is focused right now on the high school level. And this goes back to teaching I did for 5 years during interim term at one of our top local high schools, the Kincaid School in the Memorial area. And I went to Kincaid for 13 years, kindergarten through 12th. My children went to Kincaid, my father went to Kincaid, and I was a volunteer teacher for 5 years. And I saw how good the students were and how ready they were for what I call the science of liberty.
Very good. That's some good hands-on experience with the younger generation. I know some of your recent thinking has been stimulated by a recent column by Thomas Friedman. I guess it was originally in the New York Times, talking about the, overall economic sustainability of what's happening with intergenerational wealth transfers, and the fact that young people today are finally waking up to the fact of the debt that we're saddling them with, and therefore economic education and view into politics is becoming more of a personal issue to them than just a theoretical issue.
Right.
They're not being able to get the kind of jobs that they would like to get, and they're seeing that once they do get those jobs, they're going to be saddled with a lot of debt that you and I, as a generation, have been racking up for them to pay off in the future.
Yeah, the Friedman article got a lot of attention from all sides of the political spectrum. And I don't agree with Thomas Friedman on much, but this article just from last month's New York Times, his point was that there could be a youth rebellion, sort of like what we had in the 60s with the Vietnam War, toward the unsustainable federal deficits. $7 trillion and counting. That's more than $50,000 per man, woman, and child in the U.S. And if you add unfunded liabilities to the federal debt, you can increase that per capita debt number to 150,000, and it's growing. And there's unsustainable programs like Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and now Obamacare that's really leaving a fiscal time bomb for future generations. And these generations, the youngsters of today, many not able to vote, they were never asked by anyone or polled by anyone, is this okay? They're just getting the debt. And so there's a real opportunity here for young people to understand the true nature of government and economics. And I think the important point is, starting at the high school level, the students are not getting the other side of the story. They're getting a very watered down view of government and the clash of visions, and certainly in economics, in government, in their U.S. history courses and world civilization courses. And so my interest in all this is to bring the other side to the classroom, and that's why there's a website that's been visited by more than 80,000 people that's been online called freekincaid.org. And this website, in a very clear way, presents the science of liberty and the 6 major thinkers that all high school students should study, along with the opposite view.
I see. Well, tonight our conversation is going to be mainly about economics, but history also comes into play in terms of people trying to figure out or learn alternate explanations for what's happening in our past. And so if you're misled about what happened in the past, you're likely to think that if it was perceived as a success, that it ought to be tried again. What do you think are some of the major myths associated with American history as they related to government actions?
Well, the myths, and when I was in high school and I studied the textbooks, the myths were there, and they're still there today to some extent. And one major myth is that FDR in the New Deal got us out of the Great Depression in the 1930s, a depression that was caused by capitalism. And the textbook view is wrong on both counts. There was an artificial boom in the 1920s, which was not the result of free market, laissez-faire capitalism, but quite the opposite. The central player in the artificial boom of the 20s that led to the 1929 bust that we really never got out of in the 30s was the Federal Reserve Bank, which was created in 1913. And during the so-called Roaring Twenties, there was an easy money policy. They were inflating the money supply. They were keeping interest rates artificially low for business. And because of this, you had a speculative boom. If it's easier to borrow money, it's easier to engage in a variety of speculative activities for the individual, for a business. But you can't keep doing it forever. And the Depression of October 1929 was the beginning of the unraveling of this unsound boom. And what the United States had done in prior economic collapses, including in 1920-21, was to follow a laissez-faire policy where you let all the unsound investments be liquidated in order to move ahead and recover and prosper. But generations of Americans have learned the wrong story in their U.S. history books about the cause of the Depression and how we got out of the Depression. And what's tragic about this is that the boom and bust that has occurred in recent years was really sort of a replay of the 1920s and 30s, where you have an artificial boom because of easy monetary policy from the Federal Reserve. And in addition to the Great Recession that we've been through, you had an artificial housing boom that was very much facilitated by government policies and submarginal loans by government agencies. So the artificial boom, and then rather than allowing the unsound investments to be liquidated, our whole stimulus program under Obama has been sort of a return to FDR's New Deal in different form. Massive government deficit spending, and it has really delayed recovery, and that's why we call it now the Great Recession.
Right, and I think one of the most unexplained facts having to do with the Great Depression that contradicts the standard mythology associated with it was that somehow or other the Second World War got us out of the Great Depression, and by hiring 1 million men, 1 million soldiers, that we were going to solve the unemployment problem, which it certainly solved the unemployment problem for the time, but everybody was concerned, what's going to happen when these 1 million men come back from all this fighting? We've got to keep government spending going, and what are they all going to do? Well, when government finally stepped aside with most of the regulations that were put in for the Second World War, the economy naturally absorbed all those folks, and we had some of the greatest boom years, or at least growth years, in the American economy after the Second World War ended.
Yeah, that's correct. So getting back to the myths of American history, the myth that capitalism or capitalist greed created the Depression, the artificial boom, that's a myth. And then when Herbert Hoover encountered the Great Depression, there's a myth that he followed a...
This is in the 20s, right?
Yeah, this is in 1929, that Herbert Hoover somehow implemented a laissez-faire policy that made things worse. Hoover was really the first New Dealer in some important senses, that he had a very activist government response, creating the Reconstruction Finance Corporation for government loans, increasing taxes, increasing deficits, and there was a famous or infamous tariff, the Hutzelman tariff of 1932, that Herbert Hoover put into play that caused an international trade war. So Hoover kept us from getting out of the Great Depression during his term, and FDR comes in, and with his brain trusts, with the smartest guys in the room, so to speak, all his programs also kept us in the Great Depression. So the American history textbooks should develop this counter thesis and suggest, even as an alternative, that we could have and should have gotten out of the Great Depression in 1930, 1931, and we should have gotten out of the Great Recession, what we're in now, by 2010 or so.
Right. I seem to remember looking back at the Hoover's attempted re-election against FDR, that the Democratic Party platform under which FDR ran was attacking all those government programs that Hoover had advocated, and was a very, actually, if you look at the actual wording of it, quite a free market oriented platform. Of course, when FDR got into office, he completely switched directions, brought in the brain trust, and started with all the alphabetical regulatory agencies that were politically expedient at the time.
Right, and there's many more myths in the history books. If you look at major laws such as the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890 that was passed in reaction to a major tariff that was passed the same year, the theory was that we're eliminating foreign competition with the tariff. We need to make sure that domestic businesses don't form monopolies and act in the wrong way. So therefore, let's have a body of antitrust law.
Yeah, I think, go ahead.
And the other major federal laws, if you look at them, if you read the textbook version, it's very sanitized. It'll mention the public policy purpose. but little else. But what you have to do with these major laws is you have to look at the legislative history. And if you look at the legislative history, you see all sorts of things that question the reformer good government view of their passage. What you see are certain business interests that are gaining from the federal regulation, and this occurs at the state level too, where really the impetus behind a lot of these laws is not so much the outside reformers, but for-profit businesses that see ways of increasing their profits at the expense of other businesses or consumers.
Yeah, I think if you look at heard recently the history of the Sherman Antitrust Act, most of the impetus for doing that was not from consumers who had seen prices falling in both transportation, energy, steel, everything faster than the general price levels were not rising at that time either. So they were becoming a better and better buy for consumers. But it was the producers, the other producers that were being squeezed by some of what we have now come to learn as the robber barons, that were able to get the political clout going in order to pass antitrust laws. I think one of the earliest ones, even before the Sherman Trust Act, was the Meat Packers Union, which was a revolt against the fact that a new technology, i.e. refrigerated rail cars, had made it possible for a young entrepreneur by the name of Swift, who we knew as Swift and Company, started centralized slaughterhouses in Chicago, and all the local butchers who were real butchers back then that were capable of slaughtering and fixing meat found their business going to Chicago, where the meat was slaughtered and packaged and sent back out. So there was a tremendous ground up, maybe even Grange-inspired issue about antitrust and to put these monopolists out of business, even though prices were coming down for most of the products that they were offering.
So this is a myth of the robber barons that's in a lot of the textbooks. If you look closely, a lot of the businesses that were at issue here, such as John D. Rockefeller, Standard Oil, they were doing very good things. If you look at quantity supplied, you look at prices, you look at the quality of the product, new products, they're doing very well. But the muckrakers come in, and the muckrakers, they don't understand big business. They don't understand business principles such as vertical and horizontal integration. You just have this raw sense of fairness in what muckrakers feel is fair, which can be quite different from the public interest. And for instance, Ida Tarbell and her attack on Standard Oil. Well, Ida Tarbell had a brother and a father who were competing against John D. Rockefeller's refineries, and they weren't doing well. And she had some definite biases. So fairness to her was something very different from fairness for consumers overall. And Rockefeller overall was not going to government for special favor, as some of the other businesses were at the time, particularly to get tariffs. So Rockefeller is actually a good guy because he played by market rules, and he didn't initiate force against any other competitor.
Yeah, it's amazing that industry by industry we can go back and recount some of that, even just from some recent scholarship that has looked into prices and all as they were really experienced back by the people that were the consumers of the time.
So that's U.S. history. We might look at another course like government.
Okay.
And I invite any of the listeners, viewers, to look at their civics texts, look at their children's civics texts, or if there are any students, look at the index of your civics texts and see if you can find a term called government failure. Okay, now the term market failure is very well taught in economics and probably in government too, but what's funny about the government textbooks is very few of them define what government is. They define what democracy is, what socialism is, fascism, the different isms, but they don't define government itself. And for U.S. Government textbooks, the insinuation that is that government is us.
Right.
Okay. We're a democracy, we vote, we get what we deserve, and therefore it doesn't need to be defined. But if you define government in the right way, you start to see government very differently, and you understand why there's all sorts of government failure, what we're seeing today with the national debt, with Obamacare and the rest of it. It just makes sense. And the right definition of government, which you will not find in the textbooks, is government is that one institution that has a legal monopoly on the initiation of physical force in a certain geographical area. I'm going to repeat it. It is so important. Government is that one unique institution that has a monopoly, a legal monopoly on the initiation of physical force in a certain geographical region. So if you define government in the right way, you understand that it's very unique and very powerful, and you need to have a lot of transparency. You need to keep it very local, and it needs to be constitutionally constrained, because if government starts doing willy-nilly, as governments have done throughout the ages, horrible things can result. And I brought a book today, David. It's called Death by Government by R.J. Rummel. And Rummel looks at all the deaths that are associated with government, whether it's wars or concentration camps,
famines,
or all the atrocities. And he comes up with a figure of more than 300 million people that have been killed in recent centuries because of arbitrary government acts. Now, if you could come up with a total of all the murders and everything that's occurred in the private sector from criminals, I don't think you can get up to that number. So government is really society without a state. All of a sudden becomes interesting when you look at the real world of government. So the idea that government is us, that democracy can save us from ourselves is very incorrect.
Yeah, especially as it relates to going into war and things like that, where you find that most of the people or the ones that are fighting it are not in favor of the war at all. It's only the leadership that has gotten us into a lot of those foreign adventures. But let me go back to market failure again, because the concept of market failure has left the door open for government to rush in and claim that they have the solution. How about giving us a definition of market failure as is commonly understood today?
Well, the textbook definition of market failure is when the self-interest of self-interested transactions in a market without government leads to outcomes that are socially inferior, where there's an obvious problem, and therefore the government needs to come in with a solution. Now, what you need to do is you need to look at at market failure on a case-by-case basis. Okay, and if you look closely at the market failures, you can find that in a number of instances there's government failure that created the market problem. For instance, if property isn't privately owned and it's a public resource, people tend to abuse it. They throw
pollution.
Pollution in particular. You know, you throw your trash in the unowned
Sewage,
river or
effluents.
There's just lots of answers. So be careful with market failure, because a lot of them really aren't market failures, but they come out of a precondition where government was not doing its job. And here in Houston, if the government's not enforcing deed restrictions, let's say for neighborhoods, then that creates a, quote, market failure for zoning to correct, but that's the wrong way to look at it. Now, after you identify a true market failure, you have to say, okay, the case for government intervention to correct this market failure, it might work and it might not work. It could be that the government solution, that government failure is worse than the problem. So you can look at a suboptimal situation and say, no, you still don't want government to intervene, but what we need to do in these areas is we need to bring in the powerful force of civil society. Now, civil society is something between the atomistic profit-maxing individual and government. And civil society is a very important social force where we can do a lot of good as an alternative to government intervention, because government intervention, sometimes it sounds good, it looks good on the blackboard, but in the real world, it encounters all sorts of political problems. So you have to be very careful about government intervention in the economy.
Yes, and of course, the unintended consequences of what the government intervention is are A, poorly understood, and B, once understood are even harder to get rid of because of established beneficiary classes who are benefiting from that regulation. I think one of the current issues that are going on now with ethanol mandates for the fuel industry. Most people now are believing that it's not a good idea to burn food in order to make gasoline, but the entrenched agricultural lobbies and all are have so captured the federal bureaucracy and congressmen that it appears that that's going to continue for the foreseeable future, even though everyone knows it's a bad idea.
Right. The idea of energy security and not importing or oil imports being bad, therefore we need to subsidize homegrown ethanol, has been very counterproductive. And now we have environmentalists from the left and free market libertarians, they're all against it, but the program continues. And there's numerous examples of high-sounding government programs that in actuality have problems. And the latest is the so-called Affordable Care Act, which should be retitled the Unaffordable and Unreliable Health Care Act of 2009 or 2010.
Right. And that issue is, I think, contributing to what Thomas Friedman notes as a maybe coming rebellion in the class of people that are younger and starting out on their earning years, being hit with insurance costs that are far more than the options that they could have had before Obamacare came along. And it's going to be a pocketbook issue for a lot of people, especially younger people.
And the question is, will young people realize that through this massive government failure that hits them directly, that this is just the latest example of government failures and government interventions that have been counterproductive throughout U.S. and world history. And to understand this, and this is my major point, students and certainly their parents who are telling their children what to study, they need to go to the internet, they need to get beyond their textbook. In many cases, they need to get beyond their teachers who were never taught the science of liberty or libertarianism and find out the other side. And that's sort of the motivation of my website, freekincaid.org, that identifies 6 individuals and schools of thought behind the science of liberty that get beyond the textbook and a lot of classroom teaching.
Yeah, another, of course, major intrusion that the government can justify is what we talked about before, was the antitrust issues. And while that has probably settled down recently, at least a lot recently, it still remains a viable issue for unintended consequences and for further growth of government regulation of the economy. One of the more recent antitrust cases which eventually evaporated was the big antitrust case against IBM that maybe we remembered from back in the 70s and 80s, which, Microsoft came along and kind of made that a non-issue for IBM because it took a major share of IBM's business.
Yeah,
any other antitrust issues?
Yeah, just, antitrust, there's all sorts of problems with it. The Sherman Act was just the beginning of the law. But there's a number of other laws where you can get in trouble for charging more than, the same as, or less than your competitors. And most antitrust cases now are filed by business. They're private cases. They're by business versus another business where a less efficient competitor is trying to penalize a more efficient competitor. But David, I want to get back to the what I call the Kincaid Six, or the six major figures. And I think there was a slide.
Yeah,
there we go. Why don't we, or maybe we can talk about each of these.
Okay, well, starting at the top left there, we have James Buchanan.
James Buchanan.
Public choice theory.
Yeah, public choice. What James Buchanan did, and he won a Nobel Prize for it, was to apply economics to politics. And he went beyond the so-called romantic view of government to say that government officials, bureaucrats and politicians are a lot like the rest of us. They don't suddenly become angels in the public sector. They're interested in income, budgets, power,
Number of
security,
employees.
number of employees. Some of them are not well-intentioned, even some are crooks. So you shouldn't look at government different from the private sector. And in fact, he says, if you look at incentives, there's worse incentives for those in government than there are in a free market, because they don't have the profit loss feedback mechanism to know if they're doing well, number one, and number two, their time horizons are so short. You know, a politician is interested in right now and getting reelected. They're not interested in future generations like the head of a household is. So Buchanan sort of demystified government, and he has shown that there's bad incentives in government, and government officials, and not only are they like the rest of us, but they're really worse on average than the rest of us because their incentives are bad.
Let's see. Well, next up on our list is our good friend and fellow Nobel laureate, Milton Friedman.
Yeah, what would Friedman say? The students on any public policy issues should raise their hand and ask their teacher, what would Milton Friedman say? And Milton Friedman was a far-ranging scholar, and he really popularized free market economics to a new generation. And he died just a few years ago. But Friedman, the youth of today should know more than anyone else, was a leading intellectual behind the abolition of the draft, the U.S. military draft. His ideas on how a for-pay army, a professional military, was both more efficient and more moral than having conscription. But Friedman, he also endorsed the legalization of drugs, many decades ago. And he also was behind school choice, getting competition in with the public schools. And all these ideas have flowered in our time, and students should study Milton Friedman, and so should teachers if they haven't already.
Yeah, one of my favorite anecdotes about Milton Friedman was when he made a trip to China and was visiting some large construction project, dam construction project or something that they had there, and all the workers with wheelbarrows and shovels were lined up and moving this massive amount of dirt from one place to the other. And he called over one of his communist guests or hosts and told them that he felt really that if they had got some mechanized equipment like bulldozers and things, that this whole dam project could be completed a lot sooner. And the bureaucrat informed him that, yes, but if we did that, none of these men would have jobs if we brought in mechanized equipment. And Milton said, well, you didn't tell me that full employment was the issue here. If that's the case, why not give them all spoons? So he had a way of bringing some economic truth to something in a very short and succinct way.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, who's the next guy up? Oh, our knowledge problem gentleman,
F.A.
Friedrich
Hayek. Now this is interesting. Well, back when I was teaching at Kincaid, I asked the students, let's imagine that we're all the restaurants in Houston, we're going to turn it over to the government. The government's going to decide what restaurants, where they're going to be located, what's going to be on the menu and everything else. And the reason for this is we're going to improve nutrition, number one, and two, we're going to increase efficiency, because if we standardize things like a hamburger, we can get the cost way down versus, you know, all these different varieties. So we're going to get rid of a lot of duplication. And but then I explained the problem of that and how restaurants in Houston, there's no central plan. It is the results of human action and not of human design. And it's F.A. Hayek's idea of an undesigned order that explains why restaurants in Houston, which have very minimal government oversight, perform very well. Another example of Hayek's undesigned order is the internet. And we can go on and on with examples. And what's important here is the Hayekian insight that the knowledge of a rational economic order doesn't exist in central form, where a government or a group of geniuses can know it. It exists in all of our individual minds, and our knowledge enters into the economy through our decisions to buy and not buy, and through relative prices that result in profit loss. So Hayek's idea of undesigned order, it takes a lot of explaining, and the economics textbooks don't do it, but it is very central.
Yes, that's, yeah, he is. And maybe some of our viewers have seen the video that's been popularized on the internet of Hayek versus Keynes and the fight of the century about monetary policy,
Right,
and what the government should
yeah.
be
Hayek in the
doing.
Austrian School of Economics basically refuted Keynesian economics before Keynes published the general theory in 1936 that swept the world. And the problem that Keynes had is he couldn't read German very well at all. And so his macroeconomics was refuted by the microeconomics of the so-called Austrian School of Economics that F.A. Hayek and Ludwig von Mises were behind. And Mises is also on the list of the six.
Okay.
The Kincaid six, as I call them, but they can be the St. John six, the Episcopal six, all high school students, I think, should study each of these six major characters.
Okay, we need to find out who is the next
Okay,
hit
let's
list
see
of
if
the
we can get the
six.
slide of the six. Another key person.
Mises.
Well, we can talked about Mises a little bit in the Austrian School of Economics, but Mises, his theory of the business cycle, for example, pinning it on the Federal Reserve Bank and easy money policies that artificially lower interest rates to encourage speculative activity, that was a great contribution. But Mises is really the greatest economist of the 20th century. He refuted socialism back in the 1920s in a seminal article. And socialism, it needs to be taught in the high schools, and it's not, because to really understand why socialism doesn't work, you have to understand what capitalism is all about. And Hayek and Mises engaged in the very famous economic calculation debate in the 1930s that really illuminates socialism and capitalism. And this was a point that was real important for my students at Kincaid, the power of opposites. If you try to teach them something that's in the middle, that's non-political, it's a memorization exercise and they don't get it. But if you explain the clash of visions and how you have brilliant people arguing for this and other brilliant people arguing for that, and go back and forth, then you can really understand what the debate is all about. It creates those aha moments.
Mm-hmm.
So the power of opposites is what we have to emphasize, and so we need to get in the textbooks the science of liberty.
Yeah. Another anecdote, I think probably attributed to part of Mises and Hayek's work, was, of course, the problem of economic calculation under socialism. How, when you have central planning, how do you set prices for thousands and hundreds of thousands of different products that have
Right.
different resource and labor requirements, and how does that all match up? And there was a story about one of the economic planners, I think it was in Czechoslovakia or Poland, I can't remember for sure. Anyway, after the fall of the Soviet Union, they had this guy, telling about what he used to do. He used to set prices for all the commodities and products that were coming into one of those two countries. I don't remember which one. And they said, how did you ever do something so complicated as to even make sense at all? And he said, well, I had a Sears Roebuck catalog in my bottom drawer. And it had about every product that we needed, and I could see what the relative value of those products were.
Right,
But
right.
that's only because there was a price system in a free market economy to tell anybody what the correct prices for those
Right.
particular products were.
Right, so socialism, central planning, it's really, it died an intellectual death many decades ago. And even among the mainstream, socialism is dead. But what is alive and well in the mainstreams that has captured the textbooks, and many of the teachers of high school economics and government, their teachers presented a very biased view to them, so they're not as sympathetic as they should be to the science of liberty, is this idea of good government, a third way, a way between pure capitalism and socialism.
Or even state capitalism, for that matter, as evidenced by China, for instance, pointing to growth rates when the government is in charge of the economy. Which
Yeah, so the middle way is under real assault here, and if you understand government and government incentives, it's not surprising at all that government failure has come to dominate our time. And that's the opportunity here for the students, beginning in high school, to understand. And I had 9th and 10th graders at Kincaid that were excellent students, and they got it. At a young age, students can understand what's going on here with this massive government failure around them. But it's going to take some internet searches and maybe summer seminars where thousands of students are learning the science of liberty, where it is not being taught in our schools, to effectuate really a revolution of thought, where academics and teaching moves toward a free market approach in place of the nexus of altruism, collectivism, socialism.
A couple of groups that are doing all they can to promote that idea, some of whom we've had on this show before, are Students for Liberty, which is a wide-ranging international organization made up of college campus chapters, as well as Y4L. What is it again? Young Youth for Liberty? No, something. Campaign for Liberty. I'm sorry,
Okay.
I forgot. And Corey Whalen has been a frequent participant.
Well, there's
on
more
the
than
show.
1,000 different student organizations now, colleges and universities, that are pushing free market ideas, and a number of the young professors now are more inclined toward the science of liberty. And the statistic is that 1/3 of all college university students are libertarian leaning, small L libertarian. They like social freedom, they like economic freedom. And this is a percent that's expected to grow. On the other hand, the professors that are teaching them are more than 95% freedom unfriendly. They're pro-status. You see a problem, pass a law, which is sort of the simplistic view. But to refute that simplistic view of see a problem, pass a law, you really need to get into a lot of theoretical discussion that's missing from the classroom. Now, there's a slide there that was put together where they did a lot of detailed research to see what percent of college university teachers are, left of center versus freedom friendly. And it's not, it shouldn't be a surprise to see just how biased it is, because the intellectual class has always, virtually always been very much against economic freedom.
Okay, well, we can move on to another stalwart in the Kincaid Six, and that's Ayn Rand. You consider her having a lot to say about economics as well as the other things she was writing about?
Well, her implications will reach economics, but she's a philosopher. She is arguably the greatest female philosopher in the history of the discipline. She is arguably the most discussed American philosopher in history. And her philosophy of objectivism is very important for the kids. At a number of high schools, including Kincaid, there's a strong undercurrent of altruism, of selflessness, redistributionism, and Rand's philosophy of rational self-interest is very important for the kids, I think, on a personal level, to be happy in life. And certainly there's a lot of implications of her philosophy for social and political philosophy. Some of it gets to, tough love. I don't see any teachers that are giving away free good grades or averaging everyone and redistributing the grade wealth, and that's very Randian, or it's consonant with the objectivist
Okay, well,
philosophy.
we're running down on our time. I wonder if we want to say a couple of minutes worth of work on Julian Simon.
Well, Simon, you'll shift to the natural sciences and the question of sustainability with resources, with the environment, and certainly climate change would come under his worldview. And the traditional view, and it's still the textbook view, is that people are the problem. More people, more pollution, less resources, less wealth, etc. And Simon showed that really the ultimate resource is human ingenuity. And given free market incentives, there's an open-ended, better future ahead of us. More people given the right incentives, more resources, less pollution, more wealth. So people aren't the problem as they are in status societies, but the solution.
Well, I thought one of the interesting concepts I think that Julian Simon had was it's not the truth that resources are, it's that they become.
Right.
You want to?
Yeah, it's a very subtle point, but the stuff of the earth is really nothing until human ingenuity and the human element creates a supply and a demand for what is otherwise the neutral stuff of the ground. So resources become resources through the human mind and figuring out the machinery to use resources and to find resources.
Yeah, like silicon or sand used in computer chips, or of course shale, all the interesting technology that's being used to tap shale gas, which of course was not a resource before we knew how to get it. It was just something lying way down there and inaccessible to everyone, has now turned to a major milestone maybe in our energy
Right. So the idea of fixed depleting resources is actually a myth in a business and economic sense. Resources are expanding, not depleting.
Okay, well, we're about to wind up. Do you have anything you would like to say in conclusion? I know we'd like to encourage our viewers to look into the websites that we have put on the screen a number of times, and to do some serious thinking about challenging what is being portrayed in the mainstream establishment sometimes about the history of economics especially, and about the efficiency of government intervention with leaving out the unintended consequences.
Right. There's a lot of open knowledge, open questions, U.S. history, world civilization, government, and economics, and I'd urge all the students, raise your hand, challenge the textbook, challenge the teacher, and go to the internet to find the rest of the story.
Very good. Okay. Well, we appreciate having you here tonight and sharing with us not only these ideas, but also we've gone into a little bit of biographical issues on the Kincaid 6. Tell us about, maybe for a minute or so, your personal plans. I know you're working on the third volume of your three-part book on capitalism, and
Yep.
how is that coming, and when should we expect the final product?
Well, this is a trilogy on political capitalism inspired by the rise and fall of Enron here in Houston. And in the process of all the research I've done for this book, it's gotten me into a lot of fundamental questions of the market versus government, because capitalism took the blame for Enron, both the boom and the bust. But guess what? The textbook view is wrong there. The whole Enron bubble and the Enron business plan was centered around government intervention in markets, special favor to corporations. And if you Google perils of intervention in Enron, you'll get to an article that I wrote. Because Enron is really a classic case study of the perils of government intervention in the economy.
And crony capitalism, as it has become known. And of course, Rob is uniquely qualified to speak about Enron because he was an employee of Enron. So thank you again, Rob Bradley, for being here. Viewers, I hope you've enjoyed the show tonight, and we will try to get back to you with other interesting guests as interesting as Rob in the future. And thanks for watching.